Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these very critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Well, here's some good news for our Canadians that are looking for some relief from some of our economic concerns. And that's all of us, of course, looking for that kind of relief. Prime Minister Carney's trip to Europe could pay large dividends, but like most investments, it's going to take a little bit of time. In the meantime, of course, negotiations will continue with the U.S. to try to find some sort of a trade deal. I want to talk about that in just a minute. Let's just set that aside and focus for a couple of minutes on what the Prime Minister is doing in Europe. A lot of people didn't even know this trip was coming up, but there are some things that are happening here, planting the seeds or maybe watering some of the seeds that were planted a little while ago that could help Canada in the long term here. The trip, of course, started off with a trip to Ukraine and a visit with President Zelensky. That's important from a strategic standpoint to kind of reaffirm Canada's commitment to Ukraine because notwithstanding some of the stuff that's coming out of Washington these days, it's still pretty obvious that Donald Trump is still a puppet for Vladimir Putin, and this so-called move toward peace is really just a push by Trump to try to, affirm Putin's plan, which is to take over all of Ukraine. So that was good. A couple of days in Poland after that. Some people are saying, well, that was just a reaffirmation of trade deals that had already been established. Well, that's okay, too, to kind of rekindle the fire there and to try to create some sort of a European-Canada connection here. So, again, that's not a bad idea. And, again, it's great to kind of reaffirm your friendship and your alliance with some of these European nations. But I want to focus for a little bit on what Carney's doing as we do this podcast in Germany. A couple of announcements there that I think are very important. One is, of course, Canada with the deal with Germany right now through Critical Mineral Partnership. Now, this is, of course, a very, very important part of what's going to happen economically for Canada and for the world, for that matter. This is one of the great assets that this country has, some of these critical minerals in northern Ontario, but there are other deposits in other parts of the country as well. And we know that a lot of deals have been signed previously with some companies because of the mining of these, because of the push for electric vehicles. That's cooled here in North America, especially because Trump doesn't believe in them. But even here in Canada, there's a great deal of pressure now from the automobile industry on the Prime Minister and on the federal government to try to ease some of the commitments to EVs simply because people aren't buying them. But nonetheless, the deal here with Germany is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, EVs are still popular in Europe for a bunch of obvious reasons. People tend to drive shorter distances in Europe because it's a smaller area, whether it's Germany to France or just within Germany, whatever the case might be. But they're still selling EVs, and so they need these sorts of materials. The other element to this, too, by the way, is they've made commitments to this that North America hasn't really. They have more charging stations, and, well, they're fulfilling what we've always talked about. If you want something to succeed, especially when it comes to things like transportation, you've got to make it economical, feasible, and at the same time convenient. Well, they're doing that in Europe with EVs, but they're looking for raw materials. Well, Canada's right here. And that's important. So that one could pay some huge benefits later on. And the bottom line here, as we've talked about in the past, and I think as the Prime Minister's talked about, is we're looking outside the United States. We're not, nixing trade with the States, but we're trying to establish and reestablish trading corridors between Europe and the East. And we'll get to that in a second, but this is a very important part. The other part that they talked about is about liquid natural gas. Now, you may recall a few years ago, when a previous German chancellor talked to a previous Canadian prime minister about LNG, and this is just around the start of the Ukraine war, and was begging our prime minister basically to try to find some way to get our liquid natural gas over there so they could be less reliant on Russia. And Trudeau said, no, it's not economically feasible. Well, yeah, it is. Where there's a will, there's a way. There's just no will on Trudeau's part, but he's gone. And the Prime Minister, Carney, has already talked to the German Chancellor about this, and Friedrich Merz seems very interested in this, and there is a way. Even Manitoba Premier Webb Canoe's already talked about using Churchill on Hudson's Bay as a possible port to just get the stuff over to there, and then you can put it on ships and take a trip over to Europe and get the materials over there. There could be even more economic ways to do this, too. Pipelines. to the east are in discussion right now, and it may well be the viable option to try to get the product to market. And it's such an essential part of this, not just for Europe, because they want to become less reliant on Russia, but at the same time, it could be a huge boon to Canada to try to find new markets and to try to get our products there. The fact that they're talking about it and making a commitment to this is very important right now. It's not going to pay off tomorrow or next week, but it could in the long term be a very, very important part of the overall strategy here to try to divest ourselves of our reliance on American markets to try to sell our products, especially our raw materials, such as liquid natural gas and critical minerals. The other element, though, that he talked about with the German Chancellor. Canada has now narrowed the choice for the purchase of these new submarines. Now, they're committed to the submarines, which is all part of Carney's commitment to NATO, to up our commitment to NATO, and that's going to include some new equipment, certainly. And he's talking to, it's just short list. It's down to South Korea and Germany. Now, a couple of weeks ago on one of our podcasts, we talked about South Korea as a very viable option for Canada and other nations to try to buy military equipment. They're ramping it up there, and other countries, quite a few other countries actually, have already taken advantage of that and are buying equipment from South Korea. Apparently, the return on this has been significant for these countries. They can get these products to countries like Canada much faster than some of the other manufacturers of this equipment. And again, it's an idea of being less reliant on the United States for these. So we don't know exactly what the decision is going to be, but the fact that there seems to be some pretty strong bonds right now between Canada and Germany indicates that maybe Germany is going to be the preferred choice to have these submarines built, but South Korea is still a very viable option right now. So that's in play, but it shows once again that the Prime Minister is not just talking the talk, he's walking the walk here trying to do this. I know some of the critics are saying, well, come on, man, you're supposed to divest yourself. What about these other markets? He's doing that. That's what this trip is all about. For people who may not be well versed in this, and that's probably most Canadians because we don't pay a whole lot of attention to this unless we have a direct interest in it. It takes time for these deals to, first of all, to be struck, and second of all, for them to have some sort of an impact. So the fact that we're doing this is in itself the right thing to do because we hadn't been doing it, and previous governments just had been talking the talk and not walking the walk. So we're making positive steps here, and that's going to do well for us in the future. Now, let me focus a little bit now on what's going on here on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. And that, of course, is the discussion between Canada and the U.S. to try to find some sort of a trade deal. As we speak this podcast, the Canadian representative, the lead representative, I guess, Dominic LeBlanc, is back in Washington talking to his counterpart, Ludnick, about trying to find some sort of a deal. Now, LeBlanc has basically echoed what the Prime Minister has talked about for the last little while here, is that the goal on Canada's part here is to find some sort of a bilateral agreement that's actually going to help lessen the impact of Trump's tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, things of that nature. And because we know the tariffs aren't going away. I mean, they've made that pretty clear. He's not going to drop the tariffs on those materials. It's hurting our economy a lot. And what they're looking for here is a reduction on these very punitive tariffs that have been imposed on those items. And there may be some things that have to be put on the table that we're not necessarily comfortable with. You know, the Prime Minister's already taken some heat from some sources because he's backed off on some of the counter tariffs, which I think still was the right move to do. Because many of those things that had previously had tariffs on were things that should have been covered under the Kuzma deal with the United States. And if we had continued to have those on, you're really running the risk of the United States saying, yeah, okay, you know what? No exemptions on anything. Okay, forget that. If you guys aren't going to honor the exemptions, we're just going to rip that whole thing up. Well, that could have been very problematic for the Canadian economy. So it was the right strategic move to do this. Now, the other side of that coin, of course, is, okay, what's the payback here? Is the U.S. going to relent and give us a break here, too? In other words, oh, you've done this. Okay, you've done that. The digital service tax, you backed away from that. That's good. Okay, now let's talk about maybe reducing the steel tariffs or the aluminum tariffs or whatever the case might be. To our knowledge, there has not been a discussion like that yet. And that's, I think, what we're looking for here is, come on, United States, we're doing what you've asked. We're trying to play ball. We're trying to show that we're honest brokers here in trying to find some sort of a deal. But how do you deal with somebody who doesn't want to deal? As we've said, the United States simply wants to dictate, not to deal. And that's why I'm very, very concerned about the long-term benefits here and the long-term possibilities of trying to find some sort of a deal. I know that August 1st deadline that we talked about has long since come and gone, and there was no deal. And at the time, the Prime Minister said, look, no deal is better than a lousy deal. And I absolutely agree, and I think most people do. But at the same time, we can't continue the status quo. It's problematic for this economy. We're starting to feel some of the impacts on that already, and it may get worse before it gets better. And that's a rather frightening possibility right now, because Trump has already said that they want to renegotiate this Kuzma deal that he signed, remember, in his first term, and at the time said it was the greatest trading deal in history. It was fabulous, and now he's done nothing but criticize it and tried to blame Obama or somebody, anybody but him, said now it's lousy. Well, I don't know where he's getting the information from, but problem is, of course, is a lot of the stuff that he's using to justify what they're doing is basically a pack of lies. You know, when you increased the tariffs on steel and aluminum products just a few weeks ago, you know, he used the fentanyl crisis at the Canadian border as part of the justification. Well, we know there is no fentanyl crisis. Less than 1% of the fentanyl that goes into the United States comes across the Canadian border. But, you know, he's talking about, you know, that it's gone up considerably and the death and destruction, and we're doing something about it. I mean, as little as the fentanyl is, we have increased border security, and it's paid off. If those numbers, which are less than 1%, are even going down more, but they don't want to acknowledge that. So it's problematic. I mean, how do you counterbalance rather something with a country that's just basically based on falsehoods? So it's going to be very difficult for Dominic LeBlanc and his team to get some sort of a deal. And I know that Ludnick is really just a puppet for Trump. I mean, he's going to do whatever Trump wants him to do. And that changes from day to day, sometimes hour to hour. So are we optimistic that there's going to be a deal? I don't know. At this stage, it looks pretty problematic to suggest that we're going to find some sort of a deal here. In fact, like I said a second ago, it might actually get worse. Trump was musing again just the other day that said the imports of wood products are posing a national security threat to the United States, and he actually may raise the tariffs on wood products. Well, that's going to be problematic for the BC industry, of course. It's already hurting because of the tariffs that he's already put in place. And by the way, this crap, and that's what it is, crap, about a national security threat is totally bogus. I mean, he uses this all the time to try to justify arbitrarily putting tariffs in place. We already know that that's not supposed to be the president's job, but he's using a loophole here that if there's a national crisis, a threat to national security, that gives the president increased powers. Well, the lumber industry is not under threat, and it's not a national security threat, but he says so. I mean, that's for people that think, you know, that we're going to war, that, you know, well, we have to do something drastic here. You know, Russia is blockading our chances of getting trade to Europe, something drastic like that. He's simply using this falsely to try to justify these executive orders. And we can't do anything about it on this side of the border. That's up to the American Congress and the American Senate to do something about this, and they're spineless when it comes to Donald Trump. So that's one of the elements that we're dealing with here. It's going to be very, very difficult for LeBlanc to come up with some sort of a deal. And we do know that the possibility of more tariffs is always going to be there. Are we going to get rid of the steel and aluminum and copper tariffs? No, it's just not going to happen, not under this administration. Is it having an impact when we try to counter tariff? To a degree, yeah. And like I said, the intention was never to bring the U.S. economy to its knees, but to send a message that, you know, that we've got vested interests here too. So it's a very tangled web that we're dealing with right now. The prime minister is doing what he said he was going to do. No, he hasn't got Donald Trump to the table to find a deal that's going to be beneficial to Canada, but no country has. Notwithstanding what Trump says, no country has done that yet. And so we're still in that same sort of a situation as we were before. But at the same time, part B of this, what Carney has always talked about, is trying to divest ourselves and become less reliant on the Americans. And this trip to Europe that is ongoing right now with Germany and Poland, and some of the deals that he's striking and reinforcing are part of that plan. And it's going to take some time, but it's going to pay off for Canada in the long run. Patience is very, very difficult, especially in these difficult times. But it's something that we as Canadians are just going to have to learn, that it's going to take time, and we're just going to have to give the government some time and a little bit of slack to try to make some of this stuff work. In the meantime, well, you know, tighten our belts, buy Canadian, as we've talked about, and let's just give our government the opportunity here to try to come through with some of the things that they promised they were going to do. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Really appreciate your time on this. Of course, wherever you're watching us, we really do appreciate that on whichever platform. By the way, if you're on YouTube, don't forget to hit that notification bell and make sure that you can share this. which only increases the conversation and the discussion about some of these key elements. And check the podcast description, too, for some of the background materials. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We talked about this in the past. It's very important. We love the feedback that we're getting and the fact that we're getting new people with the podcast almost daily now, and that's fabulous. But at the same time, by hitting subscribe, you allow us to continue the work that we're doing. And it's such a very important part, of course, of the national discussion about some of these key issues. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work producing this and getting it out to you. And we'll stay in touch with what's happening over the next little while. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch with us and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.